So we are into our second panel, another group of dynamic thinkers and doers of change, of community economic and environmental change. And this is going to be led by Diane Ives of the Kendeda Fund, and I'm turning it over to you, Diane.
Thank you so much. So our panel is on resilient economies, and when Denise first contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in moderating this, my head went in many different directions because in reality, this conversation is about economies in relation to resilience factors related to climate change. But the world of economics is going through its own transformation and its own kind of tsunami, as Phil kind of teed up the phrase earlier. And so I think there's a level at which we're going to kind of start in the sphere of economics as it relates to climate change, but we are going to quickly take you on a magic carpet ride to a lot of other interesting challenges and opportunities in the world of economics overall. And they will all be interrelated, but I just want to give you that heads up that that's where we were interested in going as we were preparing this session. So I have three fabulous panelists up here with me. Robert Asaro-Angelo is the Regional Administrator for the U.S. Department of Labor and a former member of the President's Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. He comes from New Jersey and is a labor leader from there. Dayna Cunningham is the director of the Community Innovators Lab at MIT. And Gar Alperovitz is the Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland. Each of them has something remarkable to contribute. We're going to just do a little Q&A session here to introduce each of them and their ideas. So I want to start with Robert because he's had the most kind of direct and recent experience working on climate change issues during Hurricane Sandy. And so, Robert, I was wondering if you could describe and shape how your experience with Hurricane Sandy kind of shaped your understanding of the role that both the Department of Labor could play, but also that labor unions can play in addressing climate issues.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Emerald City is thanks for the panel. You know, I'll give a quick, brief overview of why is DOL involved in disaster recovery at all, right? It's laid out in the National Disaster Recovery Framework. We really have three main functions in disaster recovery. The first one is the immediate aftermath. Our most important functions in our department is protecting workers. So our OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, helps protect all responders working in extremely dangerous conditions. So after Sandy, OSHA deployed safety and health professionals throughout all the impacted areas, conducting over 1,600 outreach briefings, reaching over 41,000 workers in a pretty short amount of time. They conducted more than 3,000 field interventions, removing 8,000 workers from dangerous conditions in about a month and a half, removing 8,000 workers from dangerous conditions. And even with all that work, there's unfortunately still 16 fatalities related to Sandy, worker fatalities related to Sandy, 4 during the landfall and 12 afterwards. Mostly in the cleanup efforts, being hit by fallen trees, being electrocuted, all that kind of stuff. Second, our biggest area of assistance comes from our Employment and Training Administration, which in the form of national emergency grants. ETA provides localities, grantees, usually states and cities, with national emergency grants. After Sandy, provided $47 million worth. Much of that money turned over within a couple days of Sandy hitting, which goes to states and localities to pay unemployed workers to be out there cleaning up debris, helping recover from the storm. Actually, you know, for another conversation, New York City did an amazing job of using this money in a novel way of having folks work not only physically on storm recovery, but working, assisting people through the process of federal disaster recovery, having city departments, have the NEG grants fund city departments to help people with their housing, with reimbursements. We couldn't fund that stuff, but we could fund local help to help people get those things. And thirdly is our wage and hour division, which oversees the proper payment of wages and cleanup disaster work and also the recovery. That's the thing I'm most dealing with right now, quite frankly, is we're now at the point now where all the money from state and supplemental is coming down, and working closely with my federal partners at HUD and FEMA and our grantees at New York State, New York City, and the state of New Jersey to make sure that all the contracts are coming out for Sandy recovery and resilience. The workers are being paid the right wages, the proper wages for that area. At the first Sandy Task Force meeting, after the President issued the executive order, FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate said one of the most important things we need to realize now is that we have to make sure that we're protecting local economies and local workforces. And that's why DOL has been such a strong partner and all that stuff.
That's great. And do you have any thoughts about the role of labor in kind of those same that same time frame?
You talk about the role of how climate change has impacted, what we do, especially in New Jersey, where we've gone from, there's just so many disasters lately that it's made it very obvious that this is the new normal, right? Everybody here knows that. But from September of '97 to December of 2009, so a 12-year span in New Jersey, there was 10 declared federal disasters in a 12-year span. From February of 2010 to Sandy, there was 10 disasters in a short 32 months. So FEMA is very familiar with New Jersey right now. So it's become very apparent that this working across federal agencies, working with our partners in labor, is going to become more and more important. I come out of Laborers Union. I used to work for AFSCME as well as SEIU and the Laborers International Union construction stuff. As with everything at DOL, we are short-staffed and everything, as all federal agencies are. The labor is really more of our eyes and ears on the ground. That's where we hear the most complaints. That's where we get the best reports from out in the field, especially about worker safety. Our brothers and sisters in the building trades unions, we'll get calls that there's some guy on a 4-story roof with no fall protection. There's workers out there working with live wires who aren't properly protected. But the more the work they can do to organize in their communities and with their members and their members' families, the more that helps us enforce regulations and secure economies locally.
That's really helpful. Then the other question that I had for you was around, so with the Emerald Cities, the focus is on what we call high road jobs. And there's a huge question in the rush to help in a disaster, kind of letting go of those standards in order to get the job done. And so what ways do you see it possible to maintain high road standards in light of the disasters, certainly that New Jersey has seen?
The best way is education and preparation. And I think that's what sort of talk about how while it's never good news to have so many disasters in one place, it became increasingly apparent that every disaster came along that the local officials were more and more prepared for what they had to deal with. As striking as scary as that frequency is, it's giving them practice. So they're not just prepared for storm response of cleaning up the debris, they're prepared for walking that tightrope of disaster recovery, balancing the immediate needs of their residents, i.e. voters, versus their regulatory needs. So we're not talking about potholes here as people's needs. We're talking about housing, food, or maybe there's a boat in my driveway. These are things that the mayors and the county elected officials need to deal with immediately. And they can't always be thinking, that they're not reflexively thinking, okay, when I send my police officer over to take care of this problem, I'm going to log his time to make sure that I am following the 80-20 match with FEMA, and that I'm following all the reviews that I need to do later on down the road. And and by extension, that they're not worrying about the recovery workers' safety or when they're coming out to the job. So I think the more that we work with them in advance of storms and disasters about this kind of stuff, working with the state departments of labor, because a lot of the work, whether it might not be federal work, but it's almost always going to be public work in disaster recovery. So working with county administrators, working with local officials, I think it's something that we're seeing more and more of now, and I think that Sandy has sort of helped the federal family realize how important this is, because it was such the large geographical impact of the storm was so vast, and you're talking about a place that is extremely dense, not only with people, but with government. There's 566 municipalities in New Jersey. There's almost as many of that localities in Long Island and New York City and Connecticut. So the FEMA IGA department, which I was on loan to for 3 months after the storm, really had to sort of rewrite their book about how they do local engagement, because they're used to dealing with big areas that have way more jurisdiction per elected official. And now they realize they need to have a much more robust program to reach out to local elected officials, not only in recovery, but also now going forward to our next storms as well. Because the more the local people who are in charge after a storm are prepared for this kind of stuff, the more effective it's going to be.
That's great. So it's an important lesson to learn, is to make sure that the table is always set with labor there, because they're an important player in those. Do you have any specific thoughts about what has come out of the Sandy task force, this recovery task force?
I think a lot of great things. Quite frankly, I think there's 69 total recommendations that came out of the task force, and some of the most important ones were about interagency collaboration, which is, you hear about all the time. You always talk about breaking down silos, and you hear the same thing over and over again. But I'm actually seeing it in practice now. Like this whole past week, I've been dealing with New York City, New York State, and New Jersey, along right next to the same table with FEMA and HUD, about these cross-cutting issues of environmental review, Davis-Bacon prevailing wage supplements, what can apply to reimbursement, what can't, and trying to make the process easier for the localities. Because just like we want to have them prepared and educated, we also want to have them have a positive experience with their federal funders on all this stuff. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is trying to make the lives easier for our grantees. Because that's what sort of I think is lost in a lot of this stuff on the outside, is that the client of the federal government in disaster is the state. Even so, it's all these residents who are affected, people who are in disaster, people receiving individual assistance. The people that through the Stafford Act, we deal with the state. So trying to work with them about having a broader vision as well and making the experience easier for them by us working together is always a positive thing.
That's great. And I think that is a really important thing to note as well for Emerald Cities, is that the focus tends to be on municipalities and county governments, but clearly there's a critical role for the state to play, especially if they're the ones who are dealing directly with the federal government around these issues. So thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate it. So Dayna, I want to ask you about a question about, you recently wrote an article for an initiative called the 5,000-Pound Life. I don't know if anybody's heard about this. It's something that the Architectural League has been running since last fall. And the idea behind the initiative is to help imagine a viable American future in light of kind of urgent climate change issues and how that impacts the environment, the economy, and society. And the idea, the 5,000-pound life, comes from a calculation that Nicholas Stern made in the Stern Report, that if we all wanted to live a sustainable life, we would have basically a carbon emissions budget of 5,000 pounds per capita. And to give you a point of reference, right now in America, we're at about 8 times that amount. So each of us is way over our budget. So the question is, among these designers, is how do we live a 5,000-pound life? And what would that look like? And your piece was specifically looking at governance and participation. And I'm curious about how you kind of, in the article, how you talk about the voices and leadership from groups on the margins, which is a specialty of CoLab, is kind of really bringing those voices from the margins to critical transformation to a more resilient society. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about kind of what you wrote there and why it's relevant here.
Sure. The thing I like about 5,000-Pound Life is that it is both, it signals extreme limits and plenitude. You know, when you think of 5,000 pounds of life, that sounds like a lot, and yet it requires tremendous rigor and discipline and reduction in current lifestyles, in the US at least. And so, to my mind, that really captures an important idea about resilience, that you can, in trying to steward scarce resources, actually have a fuller life. And in that, my argument is that marginalized communities actually have a comparative advantage, because marginalized communities tend to live, you know, tend to exist within economies of scarcity or economies of limits. And what that says to me, among other things, is who gets to decide, and how will we decide what the limits are going to be, because there are huge numbers of social issues, social conflicts that come into play when you're talking about these kinds of restrictions. So who gets to decide? How do we decide? And by the way, who is we? I notice a lot patterns in our conversations about resilience. One is that we tend to separate democracy and the economy. And, you know, GAR is part of the Democracy Collaborative, which is all about wealth creation. So this idea of separating democracy and the economy is a false dichotomy that we have to get on top of. But the other thing is that we tend to think of, the discourse tends to frame minority communities as certain communities that suffer from asthma. And you know, there's a sense, certain more disadvantaged civil society being less developed in marginalized communities and communities of color. And I actually want to really challenge that idea and kind of flip the script and think about the ways, as I said earlier, that marginalized communities have comparative advantages. One is in terms of dealing with scarcity, but also in terms of this design idea that innovation comes from the margins. Extreme users of systems have really interesting insights into the limits of systems, the failures of systems, and therefore ways to innovate. And just to sort of bring that down to a very practical level, if you want to understand what's wrong with urban policing systems, talk to black boys or brown boys in hoodies. They have a wealth of information about how to innovate about urban police systems, not just being victims of police misconduct. So just flipping the script on that, but also our social compact now requires, or has for a long time required, I'm talking about social security, that the upcoming generation supports and cares for the generation ahead of them. That's, it's accepted wisdom here. Well, this next generation is a generation of color. So they are the stewards, the caretakers, both financially and, I would argue, operationally in, the 80 million retirees are to a great extent going to be cared for by people of color. So how do we think about the social compact, not as what are we going to do to help beleaguered minority communities, but how do we create an economy that supports wellness across society and that enables the caretakers to have the fullest capacity to take care of those who need care. So it's a rewriting of the script to think about the advantages of marginality in a positive way. One of the ideas, so from a democratic, economic democracy standpoint, so CoLab does a lot of work with economic democracy, and for us, resilience is grounded in that. It's grounded in what Dewey says is the capacity of communities to have very robust decision-making, but also the emotional and moral capacity across society to make empathic decisions. So what does that translate into in democratic process on a day-to-day basis? And Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is a really interesting example of that. So, there's been this discussion lately about closing down the coal mines and, boycotting coal. And a university just recently agreed to not buy any coal-fired energy. I can't remember what university it was. It was a big... Stanford. It was Stanford, big university, right? Stanford says, we're no more coal-fired energy. And, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth comes out of coal country. Their members understand better than anybody the impact of the coal economy in terms of both the environment and human health. But they're not taking a position of closing down the mines. They are taking the position that you've got to improve the lives and livelihoods of coal miners, but that you've also got to improve the environment, and you've got to improve the health system, and you've got to have alternative energy. And so for us at CoLab, the idea of resilience is really grounded in human lives and human livelihoods and the natural systems that support them, and then the democratic decision-making that is required to create the economies needed to support that framework. So Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, one of their initiatives is to take back the energy co-ops that provide electricity across rural Kentucky. These were the co-ops set up by Roosevelt under the TVA, and they're all community-owned but not community-controlled. So they've been taken over by the utility companies, even though they are owned by, the ownership structure is public. And so Kentuckians for the Commonwealth is really focused on changing the discourse and changing the membership and the representation of the co-ops as a way of driving the transition to clean energy. So let neighbors really control the co-ops and control the decision-making and deliberate in the rooms about what is best for our community and how do we change and transition to a healthier economy based on stewardship and clean energy. But the mechanism for this economic shift in this case is in the democratic control of the co-ops.
That's great. Thank you so much for saying that. So I want to get you in on the conversation. And you've been working both on the near-term community work, community-based efforts, and also some longer-term scenarios for building stronger and more stable economies. And I think there's a big question here about how we get from here to there, from A to B, however you want to describe it. And I'm wondering if you could actually kind of start building that bridge for us.
I can give it a shot. I should say I'm a political economist and a historian, and for some of you, I used to be Gaylord Nelson's assistant, the guy who started Earth Day. So I come at all this as what is emerging and what are the trends that we might build on that the press isn't covering, and how do you document some of this? And what we've been doing both at the university and in the Democracy Collaborative and some in cooperation with CoLab is looking at new institutions that anchor jobs and democratize ownership and that improve resilience and are ecologically green throughout. Now that's an interesting question. And some of the institutions do that in part and some don't. But let me give you an idea of the trends. Labor over the last 30 years has gone from about 34% of the labor force organized to about 11%, going down, and to about 6% of the private sector. Worker-owned companies of one kind or another, and they come in different flavors, and some are more interesting than others, have gone from about 250,000 to about 250,000 members to about 12 million people involved, going up at that time. What's interesting about worker-owned companies, and there are many different forms of democratization going on, is they don't get up and move. The people who live in a community, a corporation may shut down a company, move companies elsewhere, or buy out something. The worker-owned companies tend to stabilize the base. And so if you're interested in stabilizing community base over time, kind of developing that model helps not only increase changing equity, but it also begins to anchor the city and the community. And if you begin to do it with a resilience concept and an ecological concept in mind, you begin to open out a cultural aspect and a political aspect as well. And I'll talk a bit about the political aspect, which is important. The way I think about it as a historian is I think we're seeing trends, and I'll talk about them, that look to me like what happened in the so-called laboratories of democracy prior to the New Deal. Great deal of pain in the 1920s and before that. And what was going on at the grassroots level began generating paradigms which over time built up and could be generalized to national policy. So I think of this sort of thing that way. How many know about the Evergreen model in Cleveland? So we were, everybody knows about that. That itself is interesting.
Amazing.
And let me pause right there. The Democracy Collaborative, and particularly my colleague Ted Howard, did a lot of that work in helping develop that model. That idea that you could have various forms of worker ownership in a community-wide model that would be totally green and partly stabilized by using the purchasing power of anchor institutions, that was an idea that seemed crazy 10 years ago. That everyone at least hears about it, and that models, in much more interesting models in Cincinnati, for instance, in Atlanta, there are many, many cities, been 100 inquiries about it, and there's one in the Washington, D.C. area, there's one being developed in Buffalo, hopefully we've got one coming up in the Bronx, using that model both to green and stabilize and to change the ownership of wealth in the different paradigms beginning to pop up everywhere. The importance from a sustainability perspective is, in fact, we're looking at trying to begin to stabilize cities like Cleveland, which was lost really about 400,000 people, the city itself declining, and many cities like that. How do we both do the things I just mentioned, but also slowly begin to look at, if we're serious about resilience, we're going to have to stabilize our cities rather than have this game where the corporations come in and out and we lose the city, and then we lose the capacity to do, you can't do high density housing if that's going on, you can't do transportation planning. Many, many things depend upon stabilizing the community. So I could go on more and more, but I won't, to say there is a very interesting trend emerging of changing ownership, anchoring it, and getting simultaneously doing resilience planning around the country. Partly, and perhaps this is the driving force, partly because a lot of other things aren't working for people. It's almost because there are no ways to get jobs, there aren't ways to deal in many communities, and people are being forced out of really painful situations to innovate, and they're finding they can do things like this if they begin to build on some of the models that are emerging.
That's great. I would actually love for you to go into just a little bit more detail about the throwaway cities concept, and also to touch on this notion of too big to regulate, because I think they're intertwined and they get directly at this notion of how a community can be more resilient.
We've begun using the term throwaway cities, and to kind of characterize, it's not only Detroit, it's people like Cleveland is another example, St. Louis, parts of many parts of the Midwest, you see it, where you're actually literally throwing away the city, the capital base. So what happens, and this is a really interesting from the point of view of carbon as well as capital. when you go from 800,000 to 400,000 in the city, actually 900,000 like Cleveland, what you've got is half the housing is no longer useful, half the roads are no longer useful, half the highway system, the hospitals, the schools, every single institution in the city has lost its need. And simultaneously, where did the people go? They went someplace. So someplace else you're going to have to build housing, hospitals, roads, et cetera, schools, all of the things you need at extraordinary capital cost, but also extraordinary carbon cost. And meanwhile, by destabilizing the city, you can't do resilience planning in many areas, particularly transportation and high-density housing. So the costs of the way in which we're doing business, these kinds of costs are very rarely calculated. In fact, to my knowledge, there are no calculations of the costs that are sophisticated. But they pose a question that's happening all over the country. At the other end of the scale, we're getting a different form of it. We're getting gentrification and people being forced out and having to rebuild in a totally different way. But the process is also very capital costly and also very carbon costly. In any case, how do you begin to get at it? One way is, I've just suggested, stabilizing some of these institutions that are popping up that begin to use public policy also to stabilize the base. But if you think about using federal purchasing power, in the same way that the hospitals and universities in this Cleveland area are using purchasing power to help stabilize, we could imagine some really interesting things. In the Cleveland model, in a very poor neighborhood of about 40,000 people, you've got the Cleveland Clinic, you've got the Case Western Reserve, and you've got the hospitals, and they purchase in that area $3 billion with a B dollars in goods and services. That's leaving aside salaries and leaving aside construction costs. The redirecting of some part of that in Cleveland gives you one handle on it. Beginning to redirect federal purchasing in a way that helps achieve stabilization and building institutions like worker-owned companies or community-based structures like Evergreen that inherently are anchored becomes a longer-term way to get at the underlying base of the throwaway city problem. So I think we're going to see that aspect. The too big to regulate part of this is, you try to regulate carbon emissions from the big oil companies and the big coal companies. Does not seem to be possible. They are too big to regulate. And if you look down the hall on this, the people I've been kind of interested in terms of long-term trajectories, as the pain builds up and maybe political scenarios change, and I do think about it that way. I think what we're seeing is a period of not only stalemate, but reassessment and building and the possibility of the prehistory of another movement. The people that interest me about this are the University of Chicago conservative economists in the 1930s. Now, I don't come out of the conservative economist tradition, but I think it's very interesting to pay attention to what they said. And some of them got Nobel Prizes for an aspect of the argument I'm going to just repeat, which is their argument. From a free market point of view, these old conservative economists, Henry C. Simon, the founder of the Chicago School, was one of them, Milton Friedman's teacher, a revered teacher. They said, we need a free market competitive economy, but these big corporations are actually monopolies of a form, and they are destroying the free market. So from a free market point of view, we've got a problem with the big corporations. Now, if you try to regulate them, this is their argument, they are too big to regulate. They'll take over the regulatory process de facto. And that's the Nobel Prize winning work was done on showing how, in fact, we get de facto co-optation of the regulatory, and many people see that now. And then they argue, these conservatives, well, if you try to break them up, which is the other alternative, antitrust, and think about this in terms of the big banks, when you try to break them up, they will regroup. The big fish will eat the little fish, and Standard Oil, AT&T will be back at the same place. So the old conservatives said, someplace down the line, if you want a free market economy, they must be made into public utilities, nationalize them. So think about the paradigm. We are not there yet, but I suspect at some point, if these little models of changing ownership to benefit the community, we may begin to see either regionalization or very interesting ideas may pop out of the emergent pain levels over in this prehistory period. But that's the argument about if they're too big to regulate, what do we do about them? And in addition, anybody who's watched trying to get location of corporations to stabilize communities is a fool's task. It's extremely difficult. They come in for the tax benefits and they go out and destabilize. So that's another piece of too big to regulate. How do we use public policy How do we use new institution building to stabilize the base of the community? One of the things about in Cleveland and elsewhere, when you begin to build these new institutions, all of a sudden the mayor has a different, slightly different political base. He can begin to point in a new direction. He's not, and there's no place where it's powerful enough to really challenge, but the mayor begins to look good if he begins doing these other things, and it gives him a slightly different negotiating position against the corporations when they come in for their deal and how it's organized. So part of this is political economy. That is the building of an alternative institutional base in general for a more progressive and more ecologically sustainable politics at the local level.
Rob, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to say anything else about that?
No,
okay, good. So
I just wanted to say one thing about that, because what's really interesting to watch the way labor unions have begun to shift on this direction. I worked with steel workers with the Youngstown crisis many years ago to set up a large worker-owned company. The Steel Workers International was against setting up a worker-owned company in Youngstown way back in the 70s, late 70s. They are now the biggest proponent of worker co-ops with some form of union structure, and they're leading the fight along with the Mondragon people, and our friend Mr. Peck back here have been doing fantastic work in places like Cincinnati with support of labor in these areas. So it's a really important change of the institutional politics.
That's great. So we're trying to seed a few ideas for you all with your postcards, and I just want to tease out a couple more just real quickly before we wrap up. And so probably Gar and Dayna, you may be the best to talk about it, but Rob, feel free to jump in too. The concept of democratic ownership, the concept of anchor institutions. I mean, these are just, they're not like, oh, let's try a little project here, but what we're talking about is creating an ecosystem that begins to, I'm sure this is not a real world, but to operate collectively across all of these different sectors. And so I'm wondering if you could just touch on that just a little bit to get people's ideas churning.
This was a crazy idea about 10 years ago, but what we're seeing is so many communities realizing that hospitals and universities in particular cannot move. They actually are the residue of the old industrial system. They were built up because there were a lot of workers and payments in cities like Detroit and Cleveland. And they could be turning that power, the purchasing power, a lot of taxpayer money, Medicare, Medicaid, education money, can be turned to help rebuild the cities in a way that also anchors jobs. And in terms of equity, it also doesn't just create a couple entrepreneurs who can make money and run off to the suburbs. It begins to stabilize and provide a different base if you do it in a cooperative way. So that's the larger kind of paradigm in the thinking and hoping about where this might go. Another thing to say about it, which is, and I've been poking around in this area for many years, in the last 3 or 4 years, there has been an explosion of interest of young people in worker co-ops and co-ops in general, and land trusts and municipal ownership. Boulder just municipalized its energy, its utility. The idea of democratization is changed radically in the last 2 or 3 years. There was a conference up at Northeastern of the New Economy movement. They had 600 or 700 people just this last weekend. And there's a conference in Oakland this next weekend of Bali, the Business Alliance for Local Economies. They'll probably have 1,000 people. Something is happening that this is catching fire amongst people who are both interested in democratizing ownership, rebuilding community, and in sustainability in general. That won't get you very far, but until it develops actual muscle on the ground. But it's very encouraging to see that the actual pain levels are generating interest in something very, very positive.
So I would just add for us on the anchor institutions, another institution that is not traditionally thought of as anchor, but that we are trying to pull into our work in the Bronx is labor. And there, labor for a couple of reasons. One, for the political muscle, really being able to make deals, wealth creation happen kind of organically through policy and in a sustained way. But also its financial might, its pension funds, and then it's just the base of workers. So we are working with hospitals as one of our core anchors. We're working with 1199, the healthcare union, across the whole spectrum, from the politics to ultimately workforce training, the whole spectrum of things that help to create land opportunities for wealth creation beyond simply the lining up of the institutional interests.
That's great. Thanks. Any other?
Just to say on that front, I think you talked earlier about the changing view of unions and cooperating with folks on development and everything else. And I've been in the movement for about 15 years, and it's, even that time, been so drastic. Seeing when I first came in, how it's only about servicing our members and growing more members. I think over time, the unions have realized that our mission is about helping all workers, not necessarily only our members. And the better off the other workers are, the better off our members are going to be. And I think you're seeing it come full circle now with the increasing minimum wage in many cities and states. And we read an article this morning about the housekeepers in New York just signed a deal. Housekeepers in New York City hotels are going to be making $70,000 a year in 5 years. And talk about economic resilience. So I think just more of that outside the box thinking on a group that wasn't always outside the box thinkers has been helpful to their members and to the communities as a whole.
Can I just say one more point on this? Because I think there's another piece of it as well, which is, so you have labor, you have the anchor institutions, but you also have to have organized communities. Right. And without that, you don't have the discipline across the system. And so we've really been trying to figure out, how do you prepare a community to be engaged economic actors in shaping the local economy? And that's not just a question of opening up job opportunities. For us, it is creating a curriculum around economic democracy and working through the mechanics of how an economy works so that people can knowledgeably, meaningfully make policy decisions in keeping with how the economy actually works. And our curriculum is so sophisticated, I haven't finished going through it yet. I don't really understand all the, I'll get there. But our community partners have had multiple, weekend-long sessions trying to work through what it takes to be actively shaping your economy for wellness and well-being.
Go ahead.
Just the thing that again, having spent a lot of time working in Washington, I actually worked both the House and the Senate and the administration at various points. We're so close to what can't happen and what doesn't work. And what, and what's interesting, either if you go out and look at some of the experimentation that's just popping up everywhere, but does not get covered by the press because there is no local press. The press does not have the capacity any longer to cover any of this stuff. They don't have an interest, very often conservative owners, but they don't have money to hire reporters. I'll give you a website, community-wealth.org. Put the dash in because there's one without, which we tend to survey this sort of thing. So that's one thing. The other part of it is increasing pain has a way of forcing innovation. And I think we're living in a period where the current stalemate may happen at the national level, but I think it is forcing all kinds of interesting things, not just to the right, at the local levels, and the mayors in some cities are beginning to pick up on it. That may actually foretell a different kind of process over time. If you think as a historian how these things begin to develop, it's very, very interesting what's going on locally that's just not covered.
That's great. So I realize that we're out of time, and Gar, you kind of teed that kind of wrap up perfectly, because I don't think we gave you an answer to what a resilient economy or economies would look like. But I hope you see yourselves as kind of active players and leaders in this laboratory of experimentation that is happening all around you in the cities that you're working in. Thank you all so much. This is great.
Thank you.